For more than 5,000 years, the most powerful empires on Earth made the same mistake. They believed Iran could be destroyed. Alexander the Great marched here with the most unstoppable army of the ancient world. The Romans tried to break it. Arab conquerors swept across it, and the Mongol hordes of Genghis Khan burned entire Persian cities to the ground. Any other civilization would have disappeared forever, but Iran didn't, because something strange kept happening. The conquerors didn't erase Persia. Persia erased them. Within generations, invaders began speaking Persian, ruling like Persians, and building Persian empires. Greek conquerors adopted Persian court traditions. Mongol warlords began funding Persian poetry and architecture. Even Arab dynasties that ruled the region soon found themselves deeply shaped by Persian language, bureaucracy, and culture. Again and again, the same pattern repeated. Empires arrived believing they would end Persian civilization forever, but instead, they slowly became part of it. So the real question is not how Iran was conquered. The real question is, how did Iran survive everyone who tried to destroy it? To answer that question, we have to travel back thousands of years. Back before the Persian Empire, before Rome, before Greece, before recorded history itself. Around 50,000 years ago, the Iranian plateau was already home to human life. Neanderthals once hunted across its mountains and valleys. Later, early modern humans replaced them, leaving behind tools, cave dwellings, and early signs of culture. But the real transformation of this land began thousands of years later. Around 7,000 years ago, early agricultural communities began appearing across the plateau. Small farming villages gradually developed into organized settlements. Archaeologists have uncovered pottery, irrigation systems, and early forms of architecture that revealed something remarkable. Civilization was emerging here at roughly the same time as in Mesopotamia and Egypt. The Iranian plateau was not a distant frontier of early civilization. It was one of its birthplaces. One of the earliest major powers in this region was the civilization of Elam. Centered around the ancient city of Susa, Elam developed its own language, writing system, and political institutions. By the 3rd millennium BCE, Elamite kings ruled over large territories in what is now southwestern Iran. Their armies clashed frequently with the powerful city-states of Mesopotamia, Sumerians, Akkadians, Babylonians. For centuries, the region was a battleground between these rising civilizations. And from one of these conflicts came something extraordinary. In the 23rd century BCE, the Akkadian king Naram-Sin fought a brutal war against Elam. But instead of endless destruction, something new happened. The war ended with a written peace treaty, one of the earliest known diplomatic agreements in human history. Two rival states formally negotiated peace and defined their political relationship. In other words, the roots of international diplomacy were already forming on the Iranian plateau thousands of years ago. But the people we call Iranians today had not yet arrived. And when they finally did, history would change forever. Between 2000 and 1500 BCE, new tribes descended into the Iranian plateau. They came from the vast grasslands of Central Asia. They were Indo-European nomads, relatives of the ancient people who would eventually give rise to the Greeks, Romans, Slavs, and many other nations across Eurasia. But this branch of the Indo-European family would develop its own identity. They called themselves Arya, the noble ones. Their homeland became known as Aryanam, the land of the Aryans. Over centuries, that name gradually evolved. Aryanam became Iran, and eventually, Iran. These newcomers did not erase the civilizations that came before them. Instead, they merged with them. The cultures of the Iranian plateau blended together, combining ancient local traditions with new languages and beliefs. Out of this fusion emerged powerful tribal groups. Among them were two that would shape world history: the Medes and the Persians. At first, they were simply regional powers, but their most powerful weapon was not military technology. It was an idea, because on the Iranian plateau, one of the most influential religions in human history was born. According to tradition, the prophet Zarathustra lived sometime in the early 1st millennium BCE. His teachings introduced a revolutionary way of understanding the universe. The universe, he taught, was not random. It was a battlefield, a cosmic struggle between two opposing forces: Ahura Mazda, the god of truth, light, and order, and Angra Mainyu, the spirit of chaos, lies, and darkness. Human beings were not passive observers in this struggle. They were participants. Every decision mattered. Every act of truth or deception helped determine the fate of the universe. But perhaps the most revolutionary idea of Zoroastrianism was something even more profound: time itself. Most ancient civilizations believed time moved in cycles, history repeated endlessly. Empires rose and fell in an eternal loop. But Zoroastrian thought introduced a radically different concept. Time had a beginning, and it would have an end. History was moving toward a final moment, a great confrontation between good and evil, a final judgment, and the ultimate renewal of the world. This idea would later appear in Judaism, then in Christianity, and later in Islam. In other words, billions of people today understand history through a framework that may have originated on the Iranian plateau. But this philosophy was about to gain something even more powerful. In 550 BCE, a man named Cyrus changed the course of history. Cyrus the Great united the Persians and the Medes into a single kingdom. What followed was one of the most astonishing expansions the ancient world had ever seen. Within a single generation, Cyrus conquered the kingdom of Lydia in Anatolia. He defeated the mighty Babylonian Empire, and suddenly, a new superpower had emerged. But Cyrus ruled differently than conquerors before him. Most ancient conquerors ruled through destruction and fear. Cyrus ruled through tolerance and administration. When he captured Babylon, he didn't destroy the city. He respected local religions. He allowed cultures to survive. He restored temples that had been damaged by previous rulers. Most famously, he allowed the Jewish population exiled in Babylon to return to Jerusalem. This act would be remembered for thousands of years, because Cyrus had created something entirely new. An empire not based solely on domination, but on cooperation between cultures. An empire that could govern enormous territories without destroying their identities. Under Cyrus and his successors, Persia became the largest empire the world had ever seen. At its height, under Darius the Great, the Persian Empire stretched from Egypt to India. Nearly half the world's population lived under Persian rule. But Persia's true genius was not its size. Darius divided the empire into provinces called satrapies. Each province was governed locally, but ultimately loyal to the king. Taxes were standardized, trade routes expanded, infrastructure improved. The most famous of these projects was the Royal Road, stretching more than 2,000 kilometers across the empire. It allowed messengers to travel at remarkable speed. For the first time in history, an empire had created a communication network capable of connecting continents. Persia had effectively invented the administrative model of empire. But no empire lasts forever, and Persia's greatest challenge was approaching from the west. In the 4th century BCE, a young Macedonian king launched a campaign that would shake the ancient world. Alexander the Great. His army crossed into Persian territory in 334 BCE. Within a decade, the Persian Empire collapsed. Persian armies were defeated, royal capitals burned, the Achaemenid dynasty vanished. From a military perspective, Persia had been conquered. But something strange happened afterward. Alexander began adopting Persian customs. He wore Persian royal clothing. He adopted Persian court rituals. He encouraged marriages between his soldiers and Persian nobility. The conqueror himself was slowly becoming Persian. And after his death, the transformation continued. The Greek rulers who inherited his empire slowly absorbed Persian culture. Eventually, a new Iranian power rose again, the Parthians. The Parthian Empire restored Iranian power in the region, and when Rome attempted to dominate the East, the Parthians stopped them. In 53 BCE, Roman general Crassus marched his legions deep into Persian territory. He expected an easy victory. Instead, he walked into disaster. At the Battle of Carrhae, Parthian horse archers surrounded the Roman army. Wave after wave of arrows rained down on the legions. Roman formations collapsed. Crassus himself was killed. It was one of the worst defeats in Roman military history, and it proved something, that history would repeat many times. Iran could fall, but it never stayed defeated. But the greatest catastrophe in Iranian history came in the 13th century. The Mongols, the armies of Genghis Khan, tore across Asia with terrifying speed. Entire civilizations vanished before them. Cities that resisted were annihilated. Millions died. When the Mongols invaded Iran, the destruction was catastrophic. Ancient cities were reduced to ruins, libraries burned, centers of learning disappeared. For a moment, it seemed as if Persian civilization itself might finally collapse. And yet, within a few generations, something familiar happened. The Mongol rulers themselves changed. They converted to Islam. They adopted Persian administrative systems. They sponsored Persian architecture, literature, and science. The conquerors had become part of the civilization they conquered. Iran had survived again. Centuries passed. Empires rose and fell. The Safavid dynasty transformed Iran into a powerful Shiite state. In the early modern era, Persian identity became closely linked with Shiite Islam. Persian culture continued to flourish. Poets like Ferdowsi preserved ancient Iranian legends. Hafez and Rumi produced some of the most celebrated poetry in world literature. Even as political dynasties changed, Iranian cultural identity remained remarkably durable. But the next transformation would come not from invasion, but from revolution. In 1979, Iran experienced one of the most dramatic political upheavals of the modern era. Mass protests spread across the country. The monarchy of Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi collapsed. In its place emerged a new political system, the Islamic Republic led by Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini. Almost overnight, Iran transformed from a Western-aligned monarchy into a revolutionary religious state. The shockwaves were felt across the entire world. And soon, war arrived once again. In 1980, Saddam Hussein's Iraq invaded Iran. The result was one of the longest and deadliest wars of the late 20th century. For 8 brutal years, the two nations fought across deserts and cities. Trench warfare returned to the modern world. Missiles struck major cities. Chemical weapons were used on the battlefield. Hundreds of thousands died. Before a ceasefire finally ended the conflict in 1988, Iran had survived yet another devastating war. But the struggles surrounding the country were far from over. In the decades that followed, Iran became one of the most influential powers in the Middle East. Its nuclear program became a major source of global tension. Western nations feared Iran might eventually develop nuclear weapons. Iran insisted its program was peaceful. Negotiations, sanctions, and diplomatic confrontations continued for years. Meanwhile, Iran expanded its influence across the region through alliances, military partnerships, and political networks. It became a central player in Middle Eastern geopolitics. But the confrontation between Iran and its rivals would eventually erupt into open conflict once again. In the 21st century, tensions between Iran, Israel, and the United States escalated dramatically. Cyber attacks, covert operations, assassinations of nuclear scientists. For years, the conflict between Iran and its rivals unfolded mostly in the shadows. But in 2026, the shadow war finally exploded into open conflict. On February 28th, a massive wave of coordinated strikes hit targets across Iran. Military bases, missile facilities, command centers, and deep inside Tehran, one strike targeted the most powerful man in the country, Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. For more than 3 decades, Khamenei had been the ultimate authority in Iran, the man who controlled the military, the intelligence services, and the direction of the Islamic Republic. But within minutes of the strike, his compound was reduced to rubble. Iran later confirmed that the 86-year-old leader had been killed in the attack, along with several members of his inner circle. The assassination shocked the world. Never before had a sitting Iranian supreme leader been killed in a foreign military strike. Within hours, Iran vowed retaliation. Missiles were launched, drones crossed borders, oil routes in the Persian Gulf were suddenly under threat. Global markets trembled as the possibility of a wider Middle Eastern war loomed. Inside Iran, the political system moved quickly to fill the vacuum. The Assembly of Experts named a new supreme leader, Mojtaba Khamenei, the son of the slain leader. His rise marked the first dynastic succession in the history of the Islamic Republic. But even as he took power, reports emerged that Mojtaba himself had been wounded during the initial strikes that killed his father. The Middle East had entered one of its most dangerous moments in decades, and once again, the Iranian plateau had become the center of a global confrontation. But for Iran, this was not a new story. For thousands of years, empires have tried to break the power of this land, and yet a civilization that began on this plateau still stands